everybody, Ty here. I hope everyone is doing well. And before I get into this video, just want to state that as we have a more notable severe weather threat, we're going to be, of course, talking about this at the end of the video. Typically, when we do our monthly outlooks, we just kind of leave it at that. But considering the fact that we have a heightened risk, we're going to, of course, have an update towards the end of the video. You'll find the timestamps in the comments section. So without further ado, let's get into it here. So we're going to be mainly highlighting some of the biggest changes we've seen from the last monthly temperature outlook in comparison to what we see before us now. So for one, when we look at the March outlook, and we put this up last week, we have seen an expansion off to the south here towards the western half of the U.S. of these below average temperature probabilities. And actually a little bit of a trim back also from the east here in regards to this as well. The probabilities have mostly remained the same, but outside of maybe a couple of changes off to the south here. And I think this is due in large part to what we're seeing in Alaska, where we're seeing those below average temperature probabilities actually increase throughout the entire state here. And what's also interesting is before I clearly remember that there were above average temperature probabilities over here towards the northern half of the state. And now we've kind of shifted away from that at this point. So some big changes going on out towards the west. In the meanwhile, over towards the central half of the U.S. here, especially towards the northern plain states, whereas before we were kind of on the fence here, dealing with maybe equal chances. Now the entire northern plains here, all the way over towards the Great Lakes, is starting to see above average temperatures probabilities coming into play here. And then over towards the northeast, you can see that where at one point we were looking at those increased chances of above average temperatures, we're now leveling off at equal chances here. Over towards the south, nothing has really changed too much. We have increased confidence over there of above average temperatures, not to be unexpected during this time of year. But one thing that I'm making note of here is the fact that we have these below average temperatures towards Alaska and such a wide area beginning to develop over here towards the west. I do think that there are going to be times where we end up seeing increased activity and a lot of shifting air masses over here towards the lower 48 as a whole here, which may also lead to a more active pattern throughout the month here. So a lot to pay attention to in regards to the weeks ahead here. Models have been kind of showing a pretty good reflection of that as well. If we go over to the precip outlook here, a few things to make note of as well. Slight little bit of expansion over here towards the western half of the U.S. here, especially over towards Wyoming, where we were seeing equal chances. We're starting to see the northwestern and extreme western halves of the state starting to see those chances of above average precip here. Not really too surprised to see that. The biggest change out towards the west really has a lot to do with what we're seeing in Alaska as well, just like with the temperatures. Whereas before, we weren't seeing any areas that were looking at below average precip, but even northern parts of the state, which were at equal chances, have now started to shift a little bit more towards those slightly higher than average precip percentiles. We're still in the 33 to 40% range, so it's not extreme confidence, but it's a very clear shift that I've begun to notice as well. So that being said here, we're going to look at the southwest now, and nothing's really changed there. There has been a small little reduction, if anything, that's popped up over here, just ever so slightly off towards the central part of Colorado here, where we're starting to level off at equal chances. Outside of that, we're still looking at our below average precipitation signal mainly existing across there, with the greatest shift for the most significantly below average areas being over towards South Texas at this point. This was a little bit further off towards the west in the last outlook. Then, of course, over towards the Great Lakes, confidence has increased, particularly over towards Michigan. Not too surprising to see this, but this is another shift that we can go over here as well. And then, of course, over towards the northeast, we're kind of a little bit more on the variable side. Maybe a slight shift over towards Maine and parts of the interior northeast in regards to our above average precip signals here as well. So the biggest reason I think that we've gotten those changes is because of the oscillations that we have here. We have the North Atlantic oscillation here, and then we also have the Arctic oscillation here. I want you to watch these blue areas in particular. There's a lot of activity that ends up happening as we go further along here. It's almost like a nice little ring has kind of developed over towards the region. A lot of cold air will be allowed to shift into the lower 48 here. This isn't going to be a significant cold blast or anything, but these cold air masses interacting with warm air coming in right after during the following week here, especially through the early to mid part of the month, is definitely going to lead to an increased amount of activity as a whole here. Eventually, we are going to start to warm up as we get towards those final weeks of March heading into April, but I do think that this could lead to increased storm activity as a whole here, both potentially in winter weather and severe weather. For the most part, I think that winter weather is going to stay off towards the north based off of the model data we've gotten here, but we'll just have to see what happens. There will still be some cold shifts a little bit further towards the south, but they're not going to be quite as long lasting as what we saw towards the beginning of the year. So let's go ahead and take a look at those temperature anomalies. Keep in mind here, we're looking at things from a week-to-week perspective on these models. We do have one model that we can look at where we can get into the temperatures and the precip. But in any case here, from what we have available to us right now from the week-to-week perspective, you can see that the greatest concentration of above average temperatures is over towards central southern Texas. Not really a surprise to be had there. But as we shift over to the middle part of the month, you can see some cold air lingering over towards the deep south by this point. Most cold air, of course, is going to be out towards the west. You saw it in the last week. You can see it in this one. And then as we go further along, it's a classic example of a negative PNA coming into play here, where we're cool out towards the west and very warm out towards the east. This does seem a bit conducive for a storm pattern for a brief period in particular. So like I said, March definitely looks like it's taking, the look of an active March is definitely taking shape at this point. So we get towards the 29th and beyond here, it looks like we do begin to level off here. Keep in mind that we're starting to get farther and farther into no man's land here in regards to range. So this can very easily go the other way here. But for the most part, I'm expecting a lot of warm air to start to take over across the lower 48 as a whole here before we end out the month. And then as we get into April, we'll have to see how things go from that point. April could look a little bit more reasonable than March, I would say, but nothing's off the table here at this point, especially at the range that we're looking at now. In regards to precip here, and this is where things get really interesting, especially as we get towards mid-month here. So right now you can see that a lot of the deep south here in particular is below average. Parts of the northwest are below average here. Most of the action is mainly focused over towards the Ohio Valley and then parts of the Sierra regions as well. But watch what happens on the next slide here. Start to see the deep south getting into the action more. We're starting to see the northwest pop up here. And then we see a little corridor that's popped up towards the northern regions of the Mississippi River and heading into the Midwest. And then the following week, this is when things really start to ramp up in activity over here. We start to see those above average values really start to take hold over the deep south here into the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes, and even the Northeast and also the Northwest. Over here towards southern Texas, where those below average precip values are really starting to come into play too. And this holds for about a week, and then by the next week, we kind of go back to the way we were towards the beginning of the month, with the exception of the Northwest, where we're staying pretty consistent with that precipitation signal. And then as we get into April here, you can also see that we still have a good bit of activity showing up over here towards the mid-Atlantic here and parts of the Northeast as well. So that being said, let's go ahead and actually take a quick look at the CPS here for the day-to-day. So a little disclaimer about the CFS, by the way. Obviously, with us looking at this day-to-day, we're going to be getting into some pretty ridiculous ranges here. I really get reluctant to latch on anything that's past 5 days, let alone 2 weeks. We're going to be looking over 30 days in advance here, so take this with a grain of salt, but this is just the early signs of a potential trend here. Not even really looking for a signal at this point as of yet, but from what we have available to us right now, this is what we're working with. So as we get towards the first and into the second, you can see that here is where our cold air is going to be running rampant over here. It's not really much of a surprise. We already kind of seen this coming. Now here comes our storm system. This is where we start to get in that warming trend here. Then right after that, here's our first cool down over towards the 6th and into the 7th. And then it's interesting after we get towards the 10th, a large part of the country is expected to cool down here. This stuff is already in range of the GFS and Euro, so there's pretty good reason to have agreement with this. And we end up seeing this as we get towards even the 300-hour mark. But as we go towards the 13th and beyond here, we start to see a little bit of a warm up here. By the time we get to the 16th, we're in that classic negative PNA look that we talked about earlier. Now, as we go further along here, we start to see another little cold snap coming in. And this is why I was saying, even though the above average outlook is pretty prominent here across the board when it comes to the month of March, there's going to be some times here and there where we're going to see some notable cold air. And you can see that it gets pretty notable here by the time we get towards the 20th, because all of these areas that you're seeing in the pink, purple, magenta-ish kind of color here, we're 20 degrees below average based on this day right now. Now, keep in mind, like I said, we're 456 hours out. We're well over 2 weeks, closing in on 3 really at this point. So, take this with a grain of salt. We continue to move forward here. We're going to see plenty more in the way of shifting before all is said and done. You can see that cold air still kind of works its way into the forecast model here, especially as we get towards the very end of the month. So, a lot of shifting around is expected just based off what we were seeing off the week to week here. Now, if we were to go ahead and take a look at said precipitation type, now this is where you really should be kind of taking this with a grain of salt here, because trying to look at anything past 240 hours is really crazy at this point. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and take a look. Of course, this is where our severe weather threat is going to be, and this isn't us talking about it just yet. That's going to be towards the back half of this. But as we mentioned before, you can see clearly that there are a lot of storm systems that are expected to come through here. In particular, there are a few that kind of interest me, but like I said, at this range, we don't even have operational models available to us. During this range, the CFS is not going to be all that reliable, considering the fact that it's the only model that we have available at this range here. There's really not a whole lot to compare it to. You can kind of work with the ensembles here, but I like to use a little bit of both personally, and I don't even show ensembles much in my forecast as of right now. I'm going to work on incorporating those in the future for the longer range runs, but in any case though, as we go further along, you can see storm system after storm system for the entire month. Even as we start to get into April here, things still look like they're pretty busy for the most part. The storm track is still going to be pretty variable at this point. Still think the north is going to get its fair share of action, especially over towards the northeast and over towards the Great Lakes. Off to the south, we're probably going to remain in the warm sector, with the odd chance of maybe one wintry system at most. But as of right now, I wouldn't be too concerned with that. But that being said, let's go ahead and get into the other elephant in the room. So we're finally at day 4. By the time we get into the evening tomorrow, we'll be within the 48-hour range to get a good look at some of the other key factors with the severe weather event here. But here's the latest that we have available to us. So right now, we had that northward extension yesterday of our slight risk, which now includes St. Louis. We've been calling for that for the last couple of days here, and it ended up happening. We've had a slight extension off towards the west here, so now we're even including Dallas and Waco at this point for Tuesday in regards to severe weather. Our greatest area of concern, however, still includes Little Rock, still includes Greenville, Mississippi, Memphis, Tennessee, Jackson, Tennessee. There has been a slight little reduction here off to the northeast in regards to this area here. So anywhere across this bend over towards northwestern parts of Tennessee, you're still going to be pretty variable. I do think there's a chance you may get pulled back into this depending on what convective models show in regards to the parameters such as CAPE, etc. Because the one thing that I've mentioned in the last few videos is global models tend to downplay the amount of CAPE that actually is available. Not that it's necessarily anything of their fault, but they're just not well designed for picking up on one of those intricate parameters. But we're going to get a better look tomorrow evening. We'll be doing a live discussion to talk about that. There also has been a southward extension of this enhanced risk as well. We're starting to get much closer towards the boot heel of Louisiana here, especially over towards the Delta at this point. So this region is definitely going to have to be watched very closely over the course of the next 36, 72 hours and even further beyond. Then, of course, as we mentioned, we have a subsequent day that follows here where we're going to have to be watching over towards the mid-Atlantic and parts of the South Atlantic coast here. I do think the areas in between here are still at risk here. Based off some of the model data that I've seen, we still have to be watchful if we're over here towards Atlanta and Columbus, Dothan as well. I wouldn't even rule out Tallahassee at this point. Jacksonville, you're a little bit more questionable, but I do think you're in that day 5 outlook or just to the south of it. But you might end up in a marginal risk. But any of these areas over here that are in between, maybe even Lexington and Columbia, you need to be watchful as well. Charlotte, Raleigh is just barely in. Raleigh's actually inside of it. Charlotte's just barely out. But also Roanoke, I'm not ruling you out either at this point. So any of these areas that are in between, and I'm going to try to highlight that area if I can. I would say anywhere amongst this region. I didn't think the stroke was that right. Pause. But anywhere along this region here, I would still be on the watch for severe weather. Most likely the threat is going to end up being overnight though. But in any case though, let's go ahead and take a quick look at the models here. So this is the overnight hours of the 3rd heading into the 4th. This is what the GFS is showing here. We're still showing a pretty solid line of storms here popping up. And the thing is, as we get into the overnight, these storms look like they're actually holding up better than they have been on the last couple of model runs here. So, like I said, I do think that areas like Atlanta and parts of central and west central South Carolina, North Carolina could end up having a little bit more action here. By the time we get towards the early morning hours of the 5th, it's a little bit more questionable, but I do expect to see some resurgence by the time we get into the afternoon, especially towards the eastern halves of the state here and over towards the mid-Atlantic. Eventually, of course, as we mentioned before, by the 6th, this moves out. And for the mid-Atlantic, we actually may see some snow sneak in from the backside of this, and then we'll be kind of going from there. Let's go and take a look at the Euro, too, and make a quick comparison there before we wrap this one up. So we're going to jump ahead here, and like I said, the Euro is actually a high-res model, so like I said in previous videos, we get a slightly better look at what the convective potential is of this system here. The convective mode, I do think we're going to have some prefrontal cells. I do think we're going to have line segments and clusters of storms, all of which could produce all hazardous severe weather, including tornadoes at this point. I do think within the main line itself, there could also be some embedded supercells with QLCS potential to go along with it. And again, just like I said with the GFS, the Euro is showing that this line holds up pretty well after midnight here. Euro's been a little bit more aggressive out of the two models here in regards to the sustainability of this line. But eventually, as we go further along here, pretty much the same outcome here. And then, of course, depending on which side of the Appalachians you're on, you're going to end up seeing some snow on the back side of this. So, pretty crazy parallel right here, from one extreme to the other. Potential for severe weather 1 minute, and then we end up getting the potential for winter weather on the back side of this. I do think the mountains are going to take up a lot of the snowfall here. So, if you're over towards DC, over towards Virginia, I wouldn't expect much, but don't be surprised if you see flurries at this point. And then from that point, we'll watch this storm system exit out, and we'll be preparing for the next one after that. We'll probably be talking about that a little bit more in Sunday's live discussion. But that being said, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, have an awesome rest of your Saturday.